Hello, everybody. This is Joseph Farrell, and I have finally completed the slides for part one of our Russia webinar. Now, I'm calling this webinar, it's going to be in several parts. I originally said 3 parts. It might go as long as 4, and it will take some time to finish all of this, but I do want to do this because I think there's some things going on in Russia that most people are unaware of, and they fit a pattern, and this is really what I want to get to. They're fitting a pattern of strategic analysis that has recurred throughout the major crises and events of Russian history. So I'm calling this webinar Russia's Current Strategic Analysis, and then the subtitle is An Analysis of Contemporary Russian Socio-Cultural Critique as Strategy, in the work of Alexander Dugin, who we will be focusing on quite a bit in part 2 and perhaps some later parts in this webinar series. But this is the first part. The subtitle of that is The Historical Background from the Emancipation of the Serfs to the Collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, to give you the idea of the historical time frame that we're talking about there with the emancipation of the serfs, this occurs in the middle of the 19th century. So our focus in this webinar is going to be from about the middle of the 19th century all the way up to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And please understand, this is a very, very thumbnail sketch of these major crises in Russian history and the strategic analysis that they incurred, all right? So I am going to be saying, before we get into the 19th century, a couple of things about some previous crises that hit Russia that exhibit the same pattern that occurred prior to the middle of the 19th century. But our focus is going to be on contemporary events beginning in the modern era, which for Russia, as we're going to see, came rather late. And this is a very important point to understand. So let's move on and look at the thesis or the proposition that I think is central to the core of this type of analysis. And I think this type of analysis is very, very deliberate inside of Russia. And we see it going on again today in the work of Alexander Dugin, who is a major advisor to the president, Russian President Vladimir Putin. So the thesis is very simple. After each major historical crisis confronting the Russian state, notice I did not say the Russian nation, but the Russian state and its culture, its secular leadership has undertaken a deep analysis of the social and cultural forces responsible for the crisis and has drafted long-term domestic and/or geopolitical strategies to deal with it, sometimes with and sometimes without the cooperation of its religious leaders. While this pattern is evident throughout Russian history, we cannot go deeply into details beyond the middle of the 19th century, as I said previously. We can, however, mention some of these prior crises to that period and what they have been. So let's look at just a couple of those. The first, of course, was the Great Mongol invasion that swept across Asia and, of course, much of Russia, what is now Russia, all the way to Muscovy, which you can see here on this map. Muscovy, this green, dark green area around Moscow. The Mongol invasion swept quite literally through most of modern-day Russia, of course, China, on into parts of the Middle East and so on. And of course, the Mongol invasion was ultimately what was driving the Turks from this region of Eurasia into modern-day Turkey. So it had an enormous influence on world history and in Russia particularly. Now, this resulted, it's important to understand the Lebensraum, if I can use that technical term from the German interwar geopolitician Karl Haushofer. For him, Lebensraum simply meant the geographic area that a particular power was confined to and how it influenced their policy. So if you consider what he would understand by the living space of modern-day Russia. Geographically, the great northern European plain, of course, extends all the way across to Siberia. This is basically one gigantic steppe or plain. The only major barriers to an east to west or a west to east invasion are, of course, the Ural Mountains, some of the major rivers, the Volga and so on, the Dnieper in Russian Asia. You can see the Dnieper River right there, as a matter of fact, on that map. So in other words, Russia's not in a very good defensive position. And this spurred the Tsar Ivan III, as he's known in Russia, Ivan the Great, who lived from 1440 to 1505. He really is the first Tsar. In fact, he is the first Grand Prince of Moscow to adopt the term Tsar, because he marries into a Byzantine imperial family, the Paleologi family. This was kind of a papally sponsored plot, incidentally, to try and get the Orthodox Church to go along and reunite with the papacy, which of course was not going to happen. But it's Ivan III that begins what is called the collection or gathering of the Russian lands. And again, this is a strategic calculation to a certain extent, because what you see happening, this green, dark green area, is the Grand Principality of Muscovy. And this light green area is the first era of expansion that really begins to get kicked off by Ivan III. And you see Russia expanding to this area, quite a chunk of Siberia that's east of the Ural Mountains here. But you'll notice that the rest of it becomes what we now know as kind of the heartland of Russia, the European Russia here. And then this expansion continues in another phase after his death, pushing all the way through Siberia. And again, the reason strategically that they're doing this is they're trying to push the Mongols and anybody else that might come from the east as far away as possible. This becomes a great big strategic buffer zone around the heartland of European Rus. All right. Now here you see the dark pink. They additionally finally conquer the old parts of Kievan Rus, or the Ukraine, and then finally make their final push into the Eurasian central area. They acquire the region around Vladivostok down here and then up here. Now you'll note that Kievan Rus and the Kamchatka Peninsula were added prior to, after this period here where they conquered Siberia. So this becomes an important jumping off point for Russian colonies, of course, in North America. But the bottom line here is that the strategic calculation was really what was behind all of this. Ivan III began the process of collecting the Russian lands, in other words, all the Eastern Slavs, under one central government here in Moscow, and creating European Russia. The rest of this is strategic calculation, and you have to look at this with a certain air or perspective of respect, because the Russian Empire was actually quite successful up all the way to this day in defending and maintaining this gigantic, vast territory, which of course is also quite resource rich. The population base to sustain it has always been the problem. But anyway, the strategic calculation is what I want to get through here. This is in large part because of their experience of living under Mongol rule for so long, which they finally were able to throw off and then begin their own push and expansion back. Now, over here on the right part of the screen, you'll see a second crisis that happens after all of this begins to start up in the 17th century. This is the patriarch, the famous patriarch of Moscow, Nikon, who, given the new status of the Russian Empire being the continuation of the Imperial Orthodox Christian Empire, Patriarch Nikon decided that he wanted to bring Russian ritual church practice pardon me, into conformity with that of the Greek church. And because of this, he provokes a a backlash against this reform, which by modern lights was very, very modest, but by the mentality of the Orthodox Christians in Russia, who were very, very conservative, very traditional, they did not like these ritual changes, and they revolted. And this revolt assumed massive proportions. And of course, this was a weakening of the state. And this is the background, ultimately, for Peter the Great and his westernizing program. Because again, what he does, and his ministers, his boyars, his nobility, they take the calculation that the church, especially under a powerful patriarch of Moscow like Nikon, was too powerful in relationship to the Russian state, in relationship to the autocracy. So Peter also understands that as long as it's that powerful, it's going to be very difficult for the Russian Empire to maintain its connection and roots to the rest of European civilization. So he begins a westernizing program, and part of this program, of course, and again, folks, I'm vastly oversimplifying, but part of this program is to bring the church under the umbrella of the Russian state itself. So he abolishes the office of the Patriarchy of Moscow and creates a what he calls a synod of 3 laymen who are going to basically run the church. This is a different type of synod than synods of bishops that would occur in the church. This is the final governing authority. And as part of this program, we'll see this being done much later. As part of this program, he requires any matter of confession that is heard in confessions. The Orthodox Church practices confession like the Roman Catholic Church, but in somewhat of a different way. But in any matter involving the state heard in confession, he required the clergy of the church to report this, in other words, break the seal of the confessional, to this synodal government. So the church under Peter the Great is effectively transformed, in a certain sense, into an internal intelligence agency. And it functions in some respects that way throughout the rest of Russian history up until the modern period. So those are the 2 big events I wanted to point out where a strategic calculation was taken and domestic and foreign policy realigned because of some sort of crisis. And these reforms, you'll note, are very, very long-term reforms. They are designed to give stability to this vast, vast empire. And this is always uppermost in Russian strategic calculation. So with that in mind, let's begin with the massive changes that began to occur in Russian society in the middle of the 19th century with this man here. This is Tsar Alexander II. You'll see his life dates over here, 1818 to 1881, a rather long-lived character, very, very influential in modern Russian history. This is the Tsar that is Tsar during the Crimean War, which of course pitted France, Great Britain, and Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, against Russia, because Russia was pushing into Central Asia, pushing southward, of course, had already by that time established its great naval base at Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula. And this, of course, was an effort to stop Russian expansion into Central Asia and to deny it its naval base in the Black Sea. And ultimately, of course, by doing so, keep Russia from exerting pressure on Constantinople and breaking out into the Mediterranean. Again, the quest for a warm water port has always been uppermost in Russian geopolitical and strategic calculation. Now, the result of the Crimean War is very interesting because, of course, Russia, when the war begins, is still under a feudal system. So in other words, for everybody else, the modern era, the industrial era has already begun. But in Russia, you still have a feudal type of agrarian economy still in existence. Industrialization is confined to the major cities, Kiev, Riga, in the Baltic states, the current Baltic states, in and around St. Petersburg, and of course Moscow. But otherwise, Russia is one great big expanse of feudalism. And of course, this means that in terms of its military potential, it's far below that of even the smaller nations like France and Great Britain, which of course are highly industrialized by this point. So the other thing we have to look at here is a short time later, of course, the American Civil War breaks out. And it is, in fact, Tsar Alexander II that sends the Russian fleet over to San Francisco, parts of it into New York, and so on, as a warning sign to France and Great Britain that if they get involved in the American Civil War, Russia might just well do so too. And of course, Alexander III was backing the Union rather than the Confederacy, which you might think is, again, a very strange thing for an autocrat to do. The problem here is that as a result of the Crimean War, Alexander II is having to come up with a plan. And again, this is part of this typically Russian strategic calculation that, all right, if we have a crisis, we need to address it and recalculate our long-term strategy. It's because of all of this constellation of factors, all of these pressures, and particularly the Crimean War, that the Tsar and the nobility in Russia understand that they can no longer continue under a feudal system. They have to create the conditions to bring the Russian state into modernity, and this is going to require industrialization, emancipation of the serfs, and this is key, and the vast construction of a strategic railway network. Because again, as the Russians are observing the American Civil War along with everybody else in Europe, they're noting that railroads are being used both by the Union and the Confederacy to move vast amounts of troops very quickly throughout the continent. And this is changing the nature of warfare. So railroads now become part of the strategic military calculation of the European powers, including, of course, Russia. So as part of the effort to emancipate the Russian serfs and begin a process of modernization and industrialization in Russia, the Russian Emancipation Plan, and this is partly the strategic calculus behind Russia's support for the Union during the American Civil War. The Russian Emancipation Plan is much more well thought out than the emancipation of the slaves in this country, because basically all that Lincoln did was, he issued his proclamation when the Civil War was over and Reconstruction was underway. Basically nothing was done in a practical sense to elevate the status economically of the emancipated slaves. They were free in law, but in actual fact, as we know, the institution continued de facto for quite some time in the South after that, and in fact in many ways was worse than it was even under slavery. In Russia, they determined that in order for emancipation to work, listen carefully, the serfs had to be given their own land. They had to become property holders, just like the nobility, on whose great farms and ranches and so on existed. So in other words, the serfs would be given and become actual owners of the land that the nobility that they were farming for owned. And to do this, to make recompense to the nobility, in other words, they didn't just decide, well, we're going to confiscate land from our own nobility, because of course the autocracy depends on the nobility to run the various departments of government. So the other part of the scheme was that the nobility would be recompensed monetarily for their lost land. So in other words, they're trying to create a win-win situation, as we would call it today. Now, as a result of this plan, the Russian government decided eventually to initiate a program of very, very low interest loans, loaning money directly to the serfs at low interest, and the serfs in turn would take that money, buy their land from the nobility. The nobility would be recompensed. Now, what this meant, of course, was that Russia needed a lot of money. And to float the bonds, to create all the money, to make this program work, this is really where Russia becomes entangled with the Western European bankers, because many of these people, of course, the Rothschilds, the Warburgs, and so on, are going to be floating the bonds to make this program work. Now, the strategic calculation here is going to change in a couple of decades and make this program even more compelling for the Western bankers, because an enemy is now going to be turned into a friend. Now, there's another part of this emancipation of the serfs, because, as I said, the ultimate goal here is to industrialize Russia, to create the conditions where Russia can become and remain and sustain being a major military economic power. All right. And part of this calculus, as I mentioned earlier, was railways. It's after the American Civil War that you see the European powers really learning the lesson of the utility of railroads to transport troops extremely well, because the major powers on continental Europe begin building what are called strategic railways. These are railways that basically honeycomb the entire country and have railroads along the border of their countries that can deploy forward troops in their forward jumping off positions during mobilization. Now, for Russia, of course, with that great big empire, this is going to be a tremendously long project, because, of course, the first thing that they have to do is build the Trans-Siberian Railroad that links Siberia strategically to European continental Russia. So this is begun as part of this strategic calculus that's being undertaken in Russia at this same time. And of course, to do this, they need more bonds, they need more money to build this enormous transcontinental railroad. You know, the Americans think in terms of their transcontinental railroad after the American Civil War, about 2,000 miles long. Well, Russia has to build one 6,000 miles long and then make it a double track so that you can run trains to and from the Far East. And this is really the process that begins the strategic thinking of, guess who? Halford Mackinder, who looks at this development and says, okay, eventually railroads are going to be the key to knitting together the Far East in Europe and not sea power. And of course, the Russians are leading the way here. So this is also impacting the strategic thinking of the West. And of course, this is still going on. It's such a gigantic territory that we're really seeing the beginning of it in the 19th century, but as far as Russia and China are concerned, we still haven't seen the end of it. This whole one belt, one road system of China is really a fallout from this strategic calculation that's going on inside of Russia during the 19th century. So all very important stuff. Now, the problem here is even European Russia alone is an extremely large area, and we're going to see one of the costs of this vast program in a minute, because Russia was still in the process of constructing its strategic railway system when World War I broke out. And the Russian rail network at the beginning of World War I was nowhere near the extent of rail mileage that even a country like France or Germany or Austria-Hungary had in order to move troops. And this is going to be a key factor during World War I. So anyway, the emancipation of the serfs as a result of the crisis of the Crimean War, a very hard-fought war, the necessity for Russia to industrialize, the realization that they had to emancipate the serfs and begin laying the infrastructure for industrialization with railroads and so on. All of this really is the impetus of Tsar Alexander II. All right. So this brings us to World War I, which of course is, and I'm going to be spending quite some time with this because this is the first major 20th century crisis to hit the Russian state. And one of the key figures in dragging Russia into this crisis is this man here, Prince Alexander Izvolsky. All right. This is the Russian man, and this is, again, a very complicated history. We can't go into all of the details, obviously, in this short webinar. But this is the man that was more or less targeted by the oligarchs, the Anglo-Saxon oligarchs in the United Kingdom, in order to complete the process of bringing Russia into the system of alliances that Great Britain was trying to construct to encircle Germany. One of the big leaders of that effort, of course, was King Edward VII, or Bertie as he was known. This encirclement of Germany was the grand strategy of Great Britain prior to World War I. Certain people in Great Britain had come to the conclusion that a war with Germany was inevitable, and the sooner the better, because, you know, wait too long, Germany was already vastly outpacing Great Britain by the time that these decisions were taken in the production of steel and so on. So the British elite decided, well, we've got basically to take Germany out. Now, part of the impetus that really spurred their contact with Izvolsky, because Izvolsky was kind of the first, if you want to think of him this way, the first Russian Atlanticist. In other words, he wanted, and this tension has really been there in Russian society since Peter the Great. Peter the Great, of course, the great so-called Westernizer. We might call him an Atlanticist today. Well, Izvolsky was the same sort of character. For a brief moment in, I think it was 1907 and 1908, or one of those 2 years, Kaiser Wilhelm II and Tsar Nicholas II had signed a memorandum of understanding between the two monarchs. And this, incidentally, was done by these two monarchs almost slyly, one might say, because neither monarch had consulted their nobility or their respective governments before they met on the Kaiser's yacht in the Baltic Sea and signed this memorandum of understanding, which basically was an alliance between Germany and Russia. And of course, you know, word got out of that, particularly in Great Britain. You know, this was just absolutely the worst thing that you could imagine, because you have all of that vast Russian potential of resources, you have all of that vast German industrial potential. It's the same old thing that we've seen over and over. So again, the British redoubled their efforts to bring Russia into the system of alliance that they were trying to build around Germany. They had already successfully wooed France, and Russia, of course, was the final necessary piece. The key man here was Alexander Izvolsky. Now, this brings us to what I said in the previous slide. Russia's industrial and strategic rail network on the verge of World War I is crucial to understanding the disaster that is going to befall Russia in World War I. Because, as I mentioned, the strategic rail network really, in spite of massive French economic aid to Russia to help build these railroads, to mobilize its massive manpower pool in the war, really was not capable of doing so. For example, from Kiev to St. Petersburg at that time, there was only a one-track rail connection. And of course, to move troops to and from the front quickly, you need a double-track system. You need railroads running along the international frontiers, and so on and so forth. For the most part, this rail network in Russia was just beginning to be developed, and it really was not in any good condition to sustain massive movements of troops at the same time as sustaining the logistical effort that Russia would have to sustain to keep, I think, about 5 to 6 million troops in the field during World War I. So in other words, the logistical problem is going to be the Russian nightmare. The second problem in World War I was, of course, the three major industrial powers in the world at the beginning of World War I, and in the order of their production, were the United States, Germany, and Great Britain. So in other words, Russia's so far down the line that it's just coming out of a feudal society from the middle of the 19th century into the modern era, and it's going to war, in a war that is going to be clearly fought and won on the basis of supply and industrial production and so on. It's going to war with one of the two premier industrial powers in the world at the time. So this is not a good situation. And the other final thing, and this is really a key component, I want you to latch on to this, because this becomes very much a part of the Russian strategic calculation after the crisis of World War I. Because if you look at the dispersion or distribution of Russian industry in World War I, guess what? It's in places like Riga in modern-day Latvia, the big city and port on the Baltic Sea, which at that time, of course, the Baltic states didn't exist. They were part of the Russian Empire. They were concentrated in and around the capital in St. Petersburg. Some concentrated in Warsaw in Russian Poland. Again, Poland was part of the Russian Empire at this point. Concentrated in Kiev, Minsk in Byelorussia, and of course Moscow. So in other words, Russian industry is all concentrated, what little heavy industry there is all concentrated in the potential theater of military operations. Okay, so in other words, should Germany begin to occupy any of those industrial centers, the war is all over. You can count all the Russian manpower you will, and it has nothing to sustain the war against Germany. This is going to be a key, crucial factor in the interwar period for Russia between World War I and World War II. So Alexander Izvolsky is the point man for the United Kingdom in bringing Russia into the system of alliances that will inevitably embroil it in World War I and lead to the disaster that we know as the Soviet Union. Now, the nobility in Russia was not entirely in favor of these strategic developments, particularly because it would inevitably mean a war with Germany. One of the most outspoken fellows in the court, in the imperial court, was this fellow here, Count Sergei von Witte. You'll note the German name. There were many German noblemen in the Russian imperial court. There was even a German background general at the beginning of the war by the name of Rennenkampf. Okay, so Sergei von Witte, and if you've ever watched the old movie Nicholas and Alexander, and there's a brief period where you see, I think it's Nicholas and Alexander, where you see Sergei von Witte warning the Tsar not to mobilize against Germany. And he makes the case that a war with industrialized Germany is just not going to go Russia's way, in spite of Russia's vast manpower superiority over Germany at that time. And of course, you know, the grisly statistics are that the Russian army was entering World War I, where the ratio of soldiers to machine guns was about 1,000 to 1. In other words, for every 1,000 Russian soldiers, there might be a machine gun company in a unit. The ratio of soldiers to machine guns in the German army at the beginning of World War I was approximately 100 to 1. So already you can see that the odds are not too good. So unfortunately, Russia didn't listen to the warnings of von Witte. And of course, I spoke in the Secret Space Program conference in Bastrop, Texas in 2015. about the Tarnów-Gorlice offensive the German Field Marshal Mackensen mounted in the spring of 1915. This offensive was supposed to have been a local offensive merely to relieve the pressure on Russian lines, but it was so successful the Russian lines began to collapse very, very quickly, and largely it was due again to the poor state of Russian logistics. And the offensive came very, very close as the Germans and Austrians went to a theater-wide offensive status. It came very close to completely cracking the Russian army, the Imperial Army, in the year 1915. So if you can imagine, Russia already, within a year of the war, is really struggling to maintain a capable and competent military in the field against Germany and Austria-Hungary. So the predictions of von Witte began to become clear almost from the outset of the war. And from Tarnów-Gorlice onward until, with one exception, in 1916, the Russian Imperial Army is basically in one long swan song, one long death ride. The exception is this man here, General Alexei Brusilov, probably by most people's lights the most capable Russian general officer during World War I. He led the 1916 Brusilov offensive against Austria-Hungary because it was the weaker of the two Central Powers by far. And I put up here the grim reality behind the invention of shock troops. It was really General Brusilov. Most people think it was the Germans that invented modern infantry tactics. It's really not true. It's really General Brusilov that invents these tactics of, instead of, squares of massed infantry trying to advance on a line or run across no man's land, small squads of infantry that are greatly dispersed due to machine gun fire, of course, that run forward and take out defense concentrations, but then move along quickly through the line and leave the actual mopping up to second and third waves of troops following up behind them. So in other words, it's really General Brusilov that invents the infiltration tactics that become the staple of the German army from this point on, and then are used with so much effect against the Russians themselves in 1917, and then the Western Allies in 1918. So Brusilov basically invents modern infantry tactics, but there's a grim reality behind why he had to do so. In equipping these squads with lots of grenades and short range and even hand-to-hand combat weapons. The reason he did this is at this time in the war, the Imperial Russian Army is beginning to run out of enough rifles for every soldier in the field. So this was his solution to give his soldiers some offensive capability when some of them didn't even have rifles. Now, he stockpiled a number of precious logistics in order to launch the offensive. The offensive was successful, but it failed to take Austria-Hungary out of the war, and it wasted the last genuine offensive capacity that the Imperial Russian Army had. From the end of the Brusilov offensive, it's really just one long kind of prolonged rout. Because the industry simply cannot keep up and sustain the supply of the Russian army in the field. And of course, it becomes a great slaughter from the failure of this offensive onward. So that brings us to the end of World War I and this prolonged crisis that World War I exhibited to the leadership of the Russian state. And by leadership now, I'm not only including, of course, the nobility in and around the autocracy, in and around the Tsar. I'm also including the revolutionaries in Russia who are looking at the same situation and concluding that there's got to be some long-term strategic changes. Now, at the end of World War I, of course, we know the story. Max Warburg advises the Kaiser to allow Vladimir Lenin to come through Germany in a sealed train up through Sweden and into St. Petersburg to begin the Russian Revolution in exchange for a promise to take Russia out of the war against the Central Powers and allow Germany and Austria to ship massive amounts of troops westward for their final offensives in France and Italy. Now, by this time in Germany, General Erich Ludendorff is the dictator, the de facto ruler of Germany. The Kaiser is more or less kind of a figurehead. It's really General Ludendorff that's running the show. His aide in the East is General Max Hoffmann. You see a picture of him here. And the Russian October Revolution occurs. Of course, it brings in Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin, and of course this guy over here, a very important figure, as we're now going to see, Lev Bronstein, also known as Leon Trotsky. Because it is Trotsky that the Soviet government sends to Brest-Litovsk, the old fortress city on the Bug River in Poland, where the treaty negotiations occur that will end the war between the Central Powers and Russia. It is Leon Trotsky that is sent to negotiate for the Soviets at Brest-Litovsk. Of course, by this time, the Tsar and his family have been overthrown. They've been arrested. So the Bolsheviks are in firm control, sort of semi-firm control. Now, at Brest-Litovsk, under Lenin's instructions, at Brest-Litovsk, Trotsky is informed to delay. And this is, again, a strategic calculation that was made by Lenin himself, that if we cave in to the Central Powers' demands to surrender too quickly, this will allow them to strike their blow against the West. And it's very conceivable that that blow will be successful, since it will have more time to be successful before American troops start arriving in great numbers. And if that's the case, then the Central Powers could turn back to the east and finish off the Bolshevik regime. So he orders Trotsky to delay as long as he can, which if you ever read the details of the negotiations at Brest-Litovsk, and it's very hard to find good books about that. There are a few out there, but mostly you have to buy used books to discover what Trotsky was doing. But Trotsky was an absolute master at this and kept delaying and delaying and delaying. And the other reason that Lenin ordered this is that Austria-Hungary, by this time in the war, by 1917, far worse off condition than Germany. Austria-Hungary is in a state of near collapse. The non-Austrian or non-German part of the Austrian Empire is increasingly demanding much more independence and autonomy from the imperial government in Vienna. So even the Austrian military is beginning to get very, very rickety. And again, Lenin knows this. So prolonging the war continually weakens the state of Austria-Hungary. In fact, by the time that the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is signed, parts of Austria-Hungary, even in Vienna, have not had any reasonably good food shipments for a couple of weeks, and starvation is beginning to set in. And if you read the cables between the Austrian and German ambassadors, you know, the Germans are taking their leisurely time too. You know, they're not nearly as bad off as the Austrians. But there's a note of hysteria in the Austrian cables to Germany. You know, sign anything, just get this over with. We need food from the Ukraine. Eventually, Ludendorff and Hoffmann forced Trotsky to sign by stating, if you don't sign the terms, this is in late February of 1918, if you don't sign the terms, we're going to go back on the offensive and just keep moving forward all the way to Moscow if we have to. And, you know, by this time, the Central Powers were firmly ensconced in the Ukraine. That would have left the Bolsheviks basically with only St. Petersburg as an industrial base to support their own security services. So under the final threat that, you know, we will just take over European Russia, and you know, you people are not going to be doing too good. So the treaty is finally signed, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Now, why have I spent so much time with this? Because I've mentioned the importance of this treaty before, but it is extremely important in terms of the strategic calculations that the Russians undertake as a result of the disaster that the First World War had been. Here you see the treaty over here, an actual page from it. Under the conditions of the treaty was signed between the Central Powers, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. So there are German, French, Turkish, and Bulgarian, Russian, and Russian versions of this treaty. The gray area that you see here is the area that the new Bolshevik government of Russia was to cede to the occupation forces of the Central Powers, and which in turn the Central Powers were planning, Germany in particular, to put puppet governments and grant a kind of semi-independence to Poland and Lithuania, Latvia, Courland, Estonia. The Ukraine was going to be jointly administered until a government could be set up there. Again, another puppet government. Now, if this is sounding familiar, folks, it should. And you'll notice this area. I want you to notice this area, because this area is precisely the area in which most of the Russian industry was concentrated. The only parts of the industrial areas of then existing Russia that were outside of this zone were, of course, up here in Moscow and up here in St. Petersburg. So again, I want to stress this because this has a huge implication and impact on what is going to happen in the interwar period inside of the Soviet Union. Because again, the Russians take a strategic calculus of the situation and adjust themselves accordingly. Now, again, I want to stress these terms obviously are a very harsh imposition of terms on European Russia, but the hidden reason for it is the British blockade. What they're trying to do is get the food basket to offset the effect of the British blockade and, you know, have a food supply to sustain both of these empires. And the resources in the region, there in the Donets Basin, there's a good amount of resources that the war industries of Germany and Austria-Hungary need, and so on and so forth. So there's a strategic calculation going on the part of the Central Powers as well when they seize this area after Brest-Litovsk. All right, and of course the final thing that the treaty does is it allows a massive shift of approximately 1 million German and Austrian troops to the Western Front for the big final 1918 offensives. So now let's look at this strategic calculus that results from the disaster of World War I. We've had the emancipation of the serfs, the beginning of the building and construction of strategic railways under Tsar Alexander II in an attempt to bring Russia and modernize it, industrialize it, and so on. As a result of the end of World War I, of course, number one, you had the Russian Civil War between the anti-Bolshevik whites and the Bolshevik Reds that, again, continued up until the early 1920s. It resulted in Trotsky creating the Red Army. But the other thing is the white forces were supported by the Western Allies, who simply more or less sent in troops to replace the German and Austrian troops in the occupied areas that were ceded under the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So the Western Allies, Great Britain, France, the United States, and even Japan, all sent troops into Russia during the Russian Civil War. So this, again, becomes part of the crisis in the strategic calculation and thinking of the Russians after World War I. The second part of the strategic calculation, and this is a very important one, is I'm sure most of you are familiar that there is an internal struggle for power after the end of the Russian Civil War within the Communist Party of the Soviet Union between Trotsky and Stalin. Now, again, I don't want to oversimplify things here, folks, but unfortunately I'm going to have to because we have very limited time to really address these strategic points. The essence of this debate was that Trotsky was arguing that the revolution had to be immediately extended and no effort spared to do so. The revolution had to be immediately extended internationally, especially in the places where it would be most probably successful, namely the former Central Powers. But in other words, Trotsky wanted to basically revolutionize the world. He was ready to go. And again, part of his overconfidence was that Trotsky had been very successful in reorganizing the old imperial army and creating the modern Red Army. The Red Army that we know today is essentially Trotsky's creation. Stalin, as we know, took the other side. He was arguing that we need to consolidate the revolution inside the Soviet Union before we attempt to export it. And the real nature of this debate is the calculus of the strategic situation that they're in after the end of World War I. World War I has decimated the Russian man pool. It has decimated home industries. It has taken people off the farms to go fight at the front and so on and so forth. So between the two, Stalin's strategic calculation is actually the much more realistic one, in that he acknowledges and is recognizing that the communist revolution cannot be exported until it's consolidated inside the Soviet Union. And of course, eventually Trotsky goes into exile, is forced into exile by Stalin, and then subsequently assassinated by Stalin. Now, the real point of all of this is that it is in the interwar period that you see several things happening as a consequence of the calculation of World War I. Because the Soviets begin their 5-year plans that we've all seen the newsreels of, the massive industrialization and dispersion of industry away from that zone that we saw back here with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. They start building industries deeper in the interior of European Russia. They certainly continue the industrialization of this region, but the real thrust of this massive industrialization is to disperse industry, strategic industry, necessary industry for any modern war effort throughout European Russia, inside of the Soviet Union, and on, this is key point here, and on into Siberia. Places like Chelyabinsk, Ekaterinburg, or as the Soviets called it, Sverdlovsk, Nizhny Novgorod, or as the Soviets called the city, Gorky. These cities that are relatively far away from any potential threat from Central Europe, meaning Germany, are far away enough that in the Soviet calculation they will be able to sustain an industrialized war effort against any European power. This is the reason for these 5-year Soviet plans. They realize that the industrialization is proceeding far too slowly and that it's far too concentrated in that area, vulnerable to invasion. So this is the strategic calculation. You'll notice that this is a domestic policy that is undertaken by the Soviet Union as the result of this strategic calculation. Now, you see something else happening inside of the Soviet Union as all of this is taking place under Stalin. Because, as I said, you're going to be building lots of industries now in the Trans-Ural Siberian area, all the way, over in places like Irkutsk or Novosibirsk. These places are going to become industrialized cities as a result of these 5-year plans. And then, of course, you have the development of the resources in the Transcaucasus region. The oil fields in Maykop and Baku and so on begin to be majorly developed under these plans. And again, you also have industrialization taking place in places like Tbilisi and Georgia and so on and so forth down towards the Turkish border. Again, in an effort to disperse industry as far away from Germany as it can. Now, obviously, World War II, the Germans kicked in the door and moved much faster and farther than they did in World War I. So things were dodgy for a period. But the point is, the strategic calculation was undertaken. We need to industrialize, we need to disperse industry, and notably, we need to begin to develop the infrastructure of industry and commerce in Siberia and the Transcaucasus. Now, the problem here is that you continue, in order to make these 5-year plans work, the Soviet government becomes further entangled with Western finance. We saw this process beginning, of course, with the emancipation of the serfs. And then the final strategic calculus that I've mentioned in some of my books is the Rapallo Treaty. The Soviets were nothing if not cynical. So they signed a treaty with Germany, the Rapallo Treaty, you'll recall, that basically allowed Germany to build and test weapons that it was prohibited under Versailles on Russian soil. So, in other words, as far as the Soviets are concerned, this is a nice way to get a hold of that nifty German technology, in addition to the technology, of course, that you're getting from America. So they were very, very comprehensive. The bottom line here is they're very comprehensive in their thinking. And they're able to do anything diplomatically to fit the long-term plan. This is why Russian diplomacy often seems to the West to be so morally hypocritical, because they're really not thinking in those terms at all. They're thinking in terms of long-term realpolitik, nuts and bolts strategic calculation. And again, we're going to see this under Mr. Putin, although with some very ingenious new twists that I think once we get to it, you're going to be rather stunned. All right. So let's move along to the next big crisis. And I'm going to be spending some time with this because I truly don't think most people really, in America especially, really get or understand the massive nature of the conflict in World War II on the Eastern Front. This is, and I'm willing to debate anybody on this point, this is the decisive theater of World War II. This is where World War II is going to be won or lost. Forget about North Africa, forget about the Italian campaign, forget about D-Day, forget about the Pacific. This is the decisive theater of World War II. And I'm going to be presenting some maps here just to give you kind of a quick overview of the war, because most people, again, are unfamiliar with what Russia really was facing. Here you have the front lines on June 22nd, 1941. That's the international frontier as it then existed. Germany and her allies have approximately 4.5 million men on this front. We're not including the front all the way up here in Finland. But there's approximately 4.5 million men along this front line. The Russians have a little over 5 million. And again, these figures vary depending on sources, but they're roughly evenly matched in terms of manpower. In terms of tanks and aircraft, the Russians vastly outnumber the Germany and her Axis allies, the principal allies being Hungary, Romania, and at that time Slovakia. Italy will enter the military conflict about a month or so after it actually begins. It will send an Italian corps to the Eastern Front. So this is truly kind of an inter-European effort against the Bolshevik menace, and this is certainly the way that the Nazi propaganda looks at it. Now, at the beginning of this, you can look at this map and see why this was such a hair's breadth away from disaster for the Bolshevik government of the Soviet Union. Because by July 9th, this is June 22nd, 1941, this yellow area, July 9th, 1941, uh, basically 2 weeks after the war begins, is the area that the Wehrmacht had conquered. And this area, incidentally, took the Central Powers in World War I about 3 years to conquer. So this is such a heavy and fast blow that it really boggles the mind. And it's during this period, incidentally, this initial 2 weeks, that you see almost 30 to 40% of the operational power of the Red Army and Air Force simply being liquidated. In other words, removed from the map. The second area here, this kind of dark orange area that you see on the map, this is the front line at the end of the 1st of September 1941. You'll notice this big salient here in purple is sticking out into the front line. This is where Hitler makes what many people regard as the strategic mistake of that campaign, because he sends Colonel General Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army southward here to encircle the forces that were still giving him significant resistance around Kiev. The purple indicates the end of the front line, and then by the 5th of December, 2 days before Pearl Harbor, the front line is, you'll notice this is Moscow right here. The front line is within just very few miles of Moscow. So in other words, all of that strategic calculation, the dispersion of industry out of this zone of Eastern Europe, the development of the industrial base in the Ukraine, the placement of industries in places like Kursk here or Orel here, this is all already under Axis occupation. And it was, in fact, during this period of the campaign that Stalin assigns the task of moving, literally stripping down every factory in European Russia and moving it eastward into the Urals, and he tasks Nikita Khrushchev to oversee that project. So the Russians do manage to transfer some of their industry past the Ural Mountains into Siberia, way out of the reach of the Germans. But in the meantime, of course, they don't have the production capacity of that industry to help the war effort. Now, as all of this is being watched by the Soviets prior to the German offensive, in 1936, Stalin does an amazing thing. He strikes a bargain with the locum tenens of the Russian Orthodox Patriarchate of Moscow, a fellow by the name of Metropolitan Sergius. I've mentioned this in some of our VidChat discussions, allowing the church to reopen some churches in the Soviet Union and to reopen seminaries and train clergy. Now, don't think Stalin's being a nice guy, because what he's really wanting to do is use the church, again, as a unifying factor for Russia, because he's seeing this German threat building up. As part of this compromise, please pay attention to this one. This is very important. As part of this compromise, what Stalin did was he kind of revived the arrangement of Peter the Great, because he required all clergy, number one, to be recruited into the security apparatus of the Soviet state, which of course is like inviting the church to hollow out your security apparatus, which I personally think is eventually what actually happened. But he transforms the clergy, again, requiring them to report any disloyalty to the Soviet state to the authorities. So this, again, is part of the strategic calculus that you often see going on in Russia. And in Stalin's case, it's almost mirroring or copying that of Peter the Great. Now, in 1942, at the beginning of the summer of 1942, this is the Axis lines on the Eastern Front. You can see that they have penetrated deeply into European Russia. Virtually all of the Ukraine is under Axis occupation, all of Byelorussia, all of the Baltic states. They're at the gates of St. Petersburg, and with this salient here, the so-called Rzhev salient, again, they're still within striking distance of Moscow. They do, however, they go on the offensive, as we now know, in the south, Operation Blue. Hitler was trying to seize the oil fields, and again, this is the July starting line. By November of 1942, the Germans, of course, are at Stalingrad. They've taken the oil fields of Maykop. They've nearly cut off the Transcaucasus region from the rest of Soviet Russia. So again, a massive military operation. We know the result of this. This was the first really successful Russian counteroffensive. The offensive began in December of 1942, cut off the Sixth Army in Stalingrad. And then if you look carefully here, what the Russians were trying to do, there were over 2.5 million men involved in this massive winter offensive. What the Russians were really trying to do was not simply cut off the Sixth Army at Stalingrad. They were actually running 4 big pincers movements. They were trying to encircle the entirety of the German army group south and literally collapse the entire southern wing of the front. So in other words, the Germans and Russians here, folks, are fighting military operations on just an enormous, enormous scale when you start thinking in terms of encircling entire army groups in countries. Okay, so the problem there was that the Russians weren't banking on the German Field Marshal von Manstein, who in February and March of 1943 struck his backhand blow. He was overheard to have said, "The best of luck to you." Here you can see the Russian movements as they were beginning this attempt to encircle the entirety of Army Group South. Von Manstein literally drove Hitler nuts because he feigned a massive strategic retreat and just simply drew the Russians further and further away from their supplies until eventually, of course, you can see here, he counterattacked in February and March of 1943. He actually eliminated about 4 Russian armies in the process. So, you know, one German army at Stalingrad and 4 Russian armies in the aftermath of Stalingrad. Of course, the Russians could afford the manpower losses a lot more than the Germans, but von Manstein, again, even after this major Russian offensive, managed to stabilize the lines once again in 1943, early 1943, more or less exactly as they had been at the beginning of the big German offensive in 1942. The only major differences were the Germans retreated out of this little bulge and this little bulge back to the line that you see. And then you had this big bulge in the line here around Kursk, which was, of course, the scene of the last big major German offensive on the Eastern Front in July of 1943. As you can see here on this map, they were trying to encircle all of the Russian forces that were in this big salient. The biggest tank battle of World War II, and in fact, the biggest tank battle in military history, was fought during this, here on this southern pincer, at a little place called Prokhorovka, where you had well over 3,000 German and Russian tanks crammed into an area, slugging it out all day long. As we know, that offensive was not successful, and it's as a result of the collapse of that offensive that really finally the Red Army is able, you see, by December of 1943, they had pushed the Germans back basically to the line of the Dnieper, and then from December to April of 1944, they've finally broken the siege of Leningrad in the north, and they've pushed to the borders of Romania and cleared out the Ukraine in the south. Now, this again, by July or August of 1944, the front line is right here, this purple area. As a result of this big bulge, Hitler again made another strategic and major miscalculation. He thought the Soviets were going to try and push up through Poland to the Baltic Sea and surround and cut off Army Group Center and Army Group North. And again, he miscalculated. The actual major Russian blow fell right against Army Group Center, frontal offensive right here. And again, It pushed the Germans back now to the area that you see here. And then finally you had the invasion of Romania. And by December of 1944, you see this front line here, they're to the gates of Warsaw. And then, of course, we had in 1945 the final German offensives on Berlin. Marshal Zhukov assaulting directly and to the north of Berlin, and then Marshal Konev from Silesia southward and up to encircle Berlin. Now, if you've noticed something here about all of these maps, you'll have noticed that for about 2.5 years of the war, the front lines are more or less stable. So in other words, in spite of these massive Russian offensives, the Germans managed to push into European Russia and conquer a significant portion of it, about 2/3 of it, within the first 3 months of the war. And it takes the Russians about 2.5 years to get the Germans out of the area they've conquered. So this is a vast expenditure of men and troops, and the statistics here tell it all in terms of just how much damage the Axis powers really did inflict, and principally Germany, of course, really inflicted on the Soviet Union. You can see the grisly statistics here. And again, folks, these statistics, it depends on your source, but most of them will give you more or less the same picture. Killed, missing in action, 4,300,000 on the side of the Axis. Principally, this is, as you note, not inclusive of German allies or civilians. This is principally and strictly German military casualties. And again, the Soviet side, you'll notice, has an almost 2-to-1 ratio of casualties, 8.3 million, and again, not inclusive of Soviet allies or civilians. This is just the Red Army. So in other words, the German kill ratio here is about 2-to-1. Okay. Germany loses approximately 11,000 aircraft, again, depending on your source. The Soviet Union lost well over 30,000, approximately 39,000. I've seen some estimates as high as 45,000. So the material losses are almost at a 3 and possibly a 4-to-1 ratio in terms of aircraft. Again, Germany losing about 23,800 tanks, and again, notice the Soviet losses are astronomical. So in other words, to appreciate what the Soviet Union did, you really have to understand that those losses really mean that it was the Soviet Union that broke the back of the German war machine, but at a tremendous cost. It gives you the idea of the tactical and operational capability of the German war machine during World War II. Now, what's all this mean? Well, again, you had a major crisis that resulted yet again in a strategic calculation, because the major enemy, Germany, had done exactly what the Russians thought it was going to do and attacked it yet again. As a result of the 5-year plans, the Russians realized that it needed to disperse its industry even more strategically around the country. And all through the period of the end of World War II, right up to the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, you see the Russians attempting to do this, placing major production facilities in the weirdest places, because again, they're not only afraid of an invasion from the West, but now they've got another problem, and that's called China. So if you look at the strategic calculation of Russia after the crisis of World War II, the first thing you note is Yalta, because at Yalta, the Russians are insisting that they are going to be able to have their influence, their sphere of influence, moved all the way into Central Europe, into Germany itself. And of course, they insist on overseeing the so-called elections in Poland and the other Eastern European nations. And again, this is pure strategic calculation to make any invasion jumping off point and push it further back into Central Europe. And of course, Germany is no longer in a position to do that. But again, the Russians are afraid of the Western powers, and particularly the United States. Now, I've mentioned the dispersion of industry because the two things that we have to take from this, if you go back and look at those maps, the reason I put those maps in this presentation is I wanted people to really understand how deeply the Axis powers had penetrated into European Russia. And what this meant, folks, was that all of that infrastructure that had been carefully built up in those places as part of the 5-year plans was basically just blasted apart. So in other words, the industrial and communications infrastructure of Soviet Russia inside of European Russia after World War II is in an absolute shambles. Now, this is part of the strategic calculation that's undertaken very, very carefully. And it's, you know, whatever you have to say about him as a man, as a calculator, Stalin was a master, because he projected the image of strength of the Red Army to the West. This was his one bargaining chip in terms of Russia's stature as a great power at these post-war conferences. And what he's carefully disguising from the West is the massive extent of damage to Russian industry and infrastructure in European Russia. What I'm telling you, in other words, is there was no way that the Soviet Union was in a position to carry out a massive invasion of the rest of Western Europe at the end of World War II. It simply would not have been able to sustain a war effort of that magnitude against France, Great Britain, and the United States. It's simply impossible. It has to, in other words, it has to rebuild. So the continuing dispersion of industry continues to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the buildup of Siberian infrastructure. And what do we see? Well, we see Putin stressing the same thing, not only the buildup of Siberian infrastructure, but a kind of a Russian version of the Homestead Act to do so, new strictures on abortion inside of Russia to build up the Russian population, tax credits for people having children, and so on. This is all part of this continuing kind of strategic calculation, because now, of course, Russia has yet another potential enemy, and that's China, even in spite of the fact that they are partners in this One Belt, One Road project. Don't think for a moment that the Russians don't know what the problem could ultimately be, namely simply the Chinese sweeping into Siberia and taking it for themselves. The other part of the post-war calculation of Russia was, of course, to acquire the bomb, the first Russian atomic bomb, named Joe, incidentally, after Stalin, was detonated in 1949, and I believe the first Russian hydrogen bomb about 1956 or 7. So they had to acquire the bomb simply for a deterrent capacity, because the industrial potential of the West was so much larger than that of the Soviet Union. Now, the other strategic calculation that you'll notice that the Russians take is, we were all told in the West that, well, they mean to dominate the world. But if you actually look at Soviet foreign policy, certainly it could be very confrontational at times, but for the most part, the Soviet Union was locked into a defensive position by design, quite literally, not only on their part, but by the West part. There were proxy wars. Their strategy was to keep the West busy and fight proxy wars, Korea being an example of that, Vietnam and the other. The real Soviet attempt to maintain parity and to exceed the West militarily was the so-called Brezhnev buildup, massive expansion of Soviet thermonuclear strategic and tactical forces, a massive conventional weapons buildup, which of course eventually bankrupts the Soviet Union. The final crack in that is taken with Reagan's SDI program, which, you know, Gorbachev knew the Soviets simply had no money left to spend on trying to maintain pace. The long view after World War II, the strategic calculation after World War II, was that the Soviet Union had to be as defensive as possible and exploit any opportunity that it could. Now, the final crisis, of course, in this post-World War II strategic calculation occurs with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Western rape of Russia, principally the American rape of Russia. And this collapse really is something that you have to view from the standpoint of this whole period of development from the end of World War II to the Soviet collapse. Because what it has done is it has brought on a new cultural critique and strategy of a very comprehensive, sweeping nature. And we're going to get back to that in the second part of the of these webinars. So I want to leave it there, and I will bid you adieu until part 2. I'm planning, I think, to have part 2 possibly in the next 3 weeks. There's going to be a lot of work. Don't count on it coming in the next 3 weeks. A lot of work to put together some slides and pick the selections and quotations that I want to bring to your attention. But anyway, I hope this was informative, gives you kind of a Cliff Notes thumbnail sketch of recent Russian history and the calculations that the Russian state has had to make. So we'll see you in the next webinar. Bye-bye, God bless, and I'll see you on the flip side.